Picture a boy of 14, the son of a minister, waking up in a walled compound in the city of Lindsay. Outside his window, the family banners still hang from the gatehouse. The bronze fittings on the door still bear his grandfather's crest, and the servants still bow when he passes. He does not know yet that within the year, none of that will exist. He does not know that the kingdom whose name his family has served for 6 generations is about to disappear from the map, and that he, personally, by name, has already been marked for relocation in a register he has never seen, kept by officials he has never met, in a capital 800 kilometers to the west that he has never visited and probably never will, except as someone else's prisoner of peace. This is the question almost no one asks about the unification of China. Everyone has heard of the first emperor. Everyone has heard of the burned books and the standardized roads and the 7 kingdoms melted into one. But almost no one has asked the obvious follow-up question. If you were born into the ruling class of one of those 7 kingdoms, if your family had governed a province, commanded an army, or sat at a king's right hand for generations, what actually happened to you the day your world ended? Did you die? Did you vanish? Did you somehow survive? And if you survived, what did survival cost? In this video, we are going to follow that question into the lives of real people, named in the historical record, whose noble worlds were dismantled by Qin's conquest between 230 and 221 BCE. Some starved, some hid, some spent every coin of their family fortune on revenge, and some, against every reasonable expectation, found their way back into power so completely that the families who toppled the conquerors became the new aristocracy of China. This is not a story about emperors and armies. It is a story about what happens to the people standing just one step beneath them when the floor disappears. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what nobility actually meant in the warring states world, because it was not simply wealth. A noble household in Han, in Zhao, in Chu, in Qi, was the living custodian of a lineage's relationship with its ancestors. Family temples sat inside the compound walls. Ritual bronzes, passed down for generations, were used on fixed days of the year to feed the spirits of the dead with wine and grain, because the dead were believed to remain involved in the fortunes of the living, and a family that failed in its rights risked more than embarrassment. It risked cosmic consequence. Status was inherited through blood and confirmed through office. A minister's son expected to become a minister. A general's grandson expected a command. This was not corruption in the modern sense. It was the entire logic of how the world was supposed to work, woven into law, marriage, burial, and memory. Qin's war machine did not just defeat armies. It defeated this logic. And the policy that followed conquest, state by state, was explicit about it. According to the records of the Grand Historian, after each kingdom fell, Qin moved its wealthy and politically connected families away from their home territory and resettled them under direct supervision near the new centers of imperial power. The wealthy and influential families of the former 6 vassal states were relocated from their native soil to places like Xianyang, Bashu, Nanyang, Sanchuan, and the Zhao area, where they could be kept under close watch. Modern historians studying these episodes estimate that the relocations covered somewhere between 10 and 25% of the noble and wealthy households of the conquered states, depending on which ancient source is consulted, with the highest recorded single figure describing a movement of 120,000 households to the new capital region alone. This was not a single event. It happened repeatedly, kingdom by kingdom, for 40 years, as Qin swallowed its neighbors one at a time, starting with the conquest of the Ba and Shu kingdoms in the Sichuan Basin in 316 BCE, and accelerating through the final brutal decade that ended with the fall of Qi in 221 BCE. Picture what this meant on the ground, in human terms, rather than in the dry language of a court chronicle. A noble household in Handan, capital of Zhao, learns that its men, women, children, and servants are to be moved under guard, away from the ancestral graves their family has tended for 200 years. The ritual bronzes can be packed onto a cart. The graves cannot. The new home, whether in the Qin heartland around Xianyang or in the distant frontier valleys of Bashu, deep in the mountains of what is now Sichuan, has no ancestors buried in its soil at all. The family's spiritual life, built entirely around proximity to the dead, is severed at the root. And this was the version of the policy that Sima Qian describes almost gently, with the term shi, meaning relocation, rather than the harsher word qian, meaning banishment, that some later texts use for the same event. Even in the kindest available framing, this was the deliberate, engineered dissolution of every noble household's independent base of local power, dressed in the bureaucratic language of resettlement. Some families were given a rank promotion as compensation, a small status increase to soften the blow of being uprooted. It did not soften much. Status without local land, without ancestral graves, without a power base of tenant farmers and client families who owed personal loyalty rather than loyalty to the law, was not the same status at all. It was a performance of nobility with the substance scraped out. For the kings themselves, the fate was sharper still, and one case in particular shows exactly how far the fall could go. Tian Jian had ruled the kingdom of Qi for 44 years, by the time it became the last of the 7 kingdoms still standing, in 221 BCE. Qi was wealthy, coastal, and had for decades avoided the worst of the fighting by simply declining to help its neighbors when Qin attacked them. His prime minister Hu Sheng was allegedly in Qin's pay, and persuaded the king to mass his defenses on the wrong border, while Qin's general Wang Ben marched in from the north instead, taking the kingdom almost without a fight. According to the surviving account, Tian Jian went to Qin voluntarily, against the advice of his loyal counselor, after Qin Shi Huang promised him an enormous estate of 500 li. The promise was a lie. When he arrived, he was sent instead to a remote village with his wife and daughter, where he was left to starve to death. The people of Qi, hearing what had become of their last king, composed a bitter folk verse mocking him for trusting an enemy's hospitality, the kind of grim, sarcastic song ordinary people make when grief has nowhere else to go. A king who had ruled for nearly half a century ended his life in a nameless village, abandoned by the very promise that had lured him there, while his former subjects sang about it in the markets of Linzi. Not every member of Qi's royal house accepted exile so passively. Tian Heng, a member of the same ruling Tian clan, briefly held the title King of Qi himself during the chaos that followed Qin's collapse a decade later, after rebellions broke out across the former kingdoms in 209 BCE. When the rebellion failed and the new Han dynasty under its founder Liu Bang closed in, Tian Heng fled with several hundred loyal followers to a small island off the coast, refusing to surrender. Liu Bang offered him a choice: surrender and receive a noble title, or refuse and watch his followers be killed. Tian Heng chose a third option that neither side had anticipated. To spare the 500 men who had followed him into exile, he agreed to travel to the new emperor's capital and surrender in person. Roughly 30 miles from the capital, he stopped and took his own life, instructing his companions to carry his severed head to the emperor as proof that he would never personally accept the humiliation of submission, even while sparing his people the consequences of his refusal. When his 500 followers on the island learned what he had done, every one of them is recorded as having taken their own lives as well, rather than live in a world where their lord had died for them and they had not. Whether every detail of that final mass act is literally accurate, the story was already being told and painted within a generation, and it survives today as one of the most haunting images of what loyalty to a fallen noble house could demand. Other noble sons chose neither starvation nor suicide, but something colder and more patient: revenge, planned over years, funded by every coin a family had left. Zhang Liang was born into one of the most senior bureaucratic families in the kingdom of Han, a state distinct from the later Han dynasty that shares its name. His grandfather had served as chancellor to 3 successive kings of Han, and his father had served 2 more, meaning that for 5 generations, His family had stood at the absolute center of the kingdom's government. He was still a young man, not yet old enough to hold office himself, when Qin annexed Han in 230 BCE and erased the chancellorship his family had occupied for a century. He did not flee quietly, according to the records of the grand historian. When his younger brother died not long afterward, Zhang Liang chose not to hold a proper funeral for him at all, and instead diverted every resource his family had left toward a single purpose: finding a man strong enough and a weapon heavy enough to kill the new emperor of a unified China. It took years. He traveled, made contacts, and eventually commissioned an iron hammer reportedly weighing around 60 kilograms for a hired strongman of extraordinary strength. In 218 BCE, during Qin Shi Huang's third inspection tour of the empire, Zhang Liang and his hired assassin lay in ambush at a stretch of marshland called Bolangsha, near what is now Yuanyang County in Henan Province, a site whose name still marks the spot on modern maps. Imperial protocol meant the emperor's personal carriage should have been the most heavily decorated in the procession, escorted by exactly the right number of identical attendant chariots. But Qin Shi Huang had learned to travel with decoy carriages after an earlier attempt on his life, switching between them unpredictably, and the hammer struck the wrong vehicle. The emperor survived. A nationwide manhunt followed within hours. Zhang Liang escaped into the reed marshes and spent the following years as a fugitive under a false name in the town of Xiapi, in what is now Jiangsu province, his entire former identity erased as completely as the kingdom he had tried to avenge. When Qin finally collapsed under the weight of rebellion a decade later, Zhang Liang did not disappear into obscurity. He became chief strategist to Liu Bang, the rebel commander who would found the Han dynasty, and is remembered today as one of the most brilliant political minds of the entire founding generation, his cunning credited with several of the decisive turns of the war that followed. The grandson and great-grandson of 3 generations of chancellors, stripped of his name and his title by conquest, eventually became the architect of the empire that replaced his enemies. A similar arc, with even greater consequence, belonged to a family of generals from the southern kingdom of Chu. Xiang Yan had commanded Chu's armies in their desperate final resistance against the invading forces of the Qin general Wang Jian. He was killed in action in 223 BCE, the year Chu fell, a defeat that ended not only a kingdom, but a family's entire reason for existing, since the Xiang clan, according to surviving genealogical claims, traced descent either from Chu's own royal house or from a long line of hereditary military commanders who had served it for generations. His grandson, a boy named Xiang Yu, born into the family that same year, grew up not in comfort, but in the aftermath of comfort, raised by an uncle after both his parents appear to have died young, in a household that had lost its army, its rank, and its kingdom in a single defeat. What happened next is one of the strangest reversals in this entire story. Decades later, when the Qin Empire itself began to collapse under rebellion in 209 BCE, it was Xiang Yu's uncle, Zhang Liang, who raised one of the first serious armies against the new regime in the region around what is now Suzhou and Shaoxing, in the lower Yangtze Delta. Xiang Yu, the orphaned grandson of a defeated general, grew into a commander of such ferocity that he is credited with the single most celebrated military victory of the entire anti-Qin uprising, the Battle of Julu, where he reportedly ordered his own troops to destroy their cooking pots and sink their boats after crossing a river, removing any possibility of retreat, then defeated a vastly larger Qin army in 9 consecutive engagements. The family that Qin's conquest had stripped of its commission very nearly became the family that unmade Qin entirely. Zhang Yu would go on to control more territory than any single rebel leader in China, and only lost the final contest for the empire to his rival Liu Bang, the same low-born official who had taken Zhang Liang into his service, in a war that dragged on for years after Qin itself had already fallen. It would be easy, telling these stories, to make it sound as though every displaced noble family eventually found its way back to greatness. Almost none of them did. For every Zhang Liang or Xiang Yu whose name survived because he eventually mattered to the historians of the dynasty that followed, There were thousands of lesser noble households whose fate was simply silence. Sons of provincial magistrates in Wei, junior officers in the disbanded armies of Yan, cadet branches of ministerial families in Zhao. All of them relocated under the same sweeping policy, registered under the new household system that Qin imposed across its territory, required to report their movements, their occupations, and their family size to officials who had never heard of the offices their fathers had once held. The empire's new census and registration apparatus did not care that a man's grandfather had been a chancellor. It cared whether he had been correctly counted, correctly taxed, and correctly assigned to a unit of collective legal responsibility, in which neighbors could be punished for one another's crimes. For most of the nobility of the 6 fallen kingdoms, this was the entire experience of defeat. Not a dramatic death, and not a dramatic revenge, but a slow administrative erasure into the undifferentiated mass of registered subjects, their names surviving, if at all, only in genealogies, kept privately by descendants who no longer held any office at all. There is a particular kind of grief in that, one that the historical record rarely lingers on because it produces no battles and no famous quotations. It is the grief of a woman who once directed a household of 40 servants, now living in a relocated compound in Bashu, where she knows no one, performing rites to ancestors buried 1,000 kilometers away in soil she will never see again, raising children who will grow up with no memory of the kingdom whose name was once their entire identity. Multiply that single household by tens of thousands, across 40 years and 6 kingdoms, and you begin to understand the true scale of what Qin's unification actually cost the people standing closest to power, the people history usually skips past on its way to the emperor and the wall and the terracotta army. What makes this particular thread of history so striking, in the end, is the paradox sitting at its center. Qin Shi Huang relocated, registered and disempowered the noble families of 6 kingdoms, precisely because he understood that hereditary power, left intact, regenerates itself and threatens the new order. He was not wrong to fear it. Within 4 years of his own death, men descended from exactly the families he had stripped of rank. A chancellor's grandson with a hammer he never got to use successfully, an orphaned general's grandson with nothing left to lose, helped bring down the dynasty his unification had built. The empire that tried to erase the old aristocracy by scattering it across the map ultimately fell, in part, to scattered pieces of that same aristocracy, reassembled by grief, patience, and the particular kind of fury that only comes from watching everything your family was promised simply vanish. History remembers the names of emperors because emperors leave behind palaces, walls, and tombs that archaeologists can still excavate today, at sites like Xianyang in Shanxi province, or the buried foundations near modern Linzi. The noble families who lost everything in 221 BCE left behind something quieter, a scattering of mentions in court records, a stele in a Henan marshland marking where a hammer missed its target, a folk song mocking a starved king that someone, somewhere, thought worth writing down. They did not know, any of them, that they were living through the end of one world and the violent, improvised birth of another. They only knew that the compound gates that had borne their family crest for generations now belonged to someone else, and that wherever they were sent next, they would have to learn how to be ordinary. And if losing a kingdom could break a family that thoroughly, the next question worth asking is what happened on the other side of that conquest. Inside the empire the noble families had been relocated into. What was it actually like to live as a subject of the regime that had just swallowed everyone? In the brief, violent years before that regime itself came apart,